Chapter 8. The Newcomer. 2 years passed without any news of Edek. Ruth and Bronya returned to Warsaw each winter, and back to the woods again the following summer. It was the summer of 1944. Out in the woods they began to realise that things were changing. Day and night the air was full of planes. From the distant city they could hear the boom of guns and the explosion of bombs. It was rumoured that the Nazis were on the defensive. Though the children didn't know it till later, the Russian Marshal Rokossovsky was sweeping westwards with 7 great army troops, driving the Nazis before him. Radio Moscow had broadcast a call to the resistance in Warsaw. "Poles, the hour of freedom is at hand. Poles to arms. Do not lose a moment. The suburbs of Warsaw are already within range of Russian guns." At once the Poles, under their own General Bohr, rose up against the German garrison. At 5 p.m. on the 1st of August, a bomb went off in the Nazi Gestapo headquarters. At the same moment, thousands of windows in the city were flung open and a hail of bullets struck the passing Germans. All traffic ceased as the Polish underground rushed to the attack. Starving people streamed out of the cellars and flung themselves upon the Nazis, with weapons if they had them, with their fists if they had nothing else. But the Germans counterattacked from their strong points. Hastily, they concentrated 5 divisions, and their Tiger tanks drove a wedge through the city as far as the Vistula. The Soviet troops outside withdrew 6 miles under orders from Moscow, leaving the Poles to fight their own battle. General Bohr was short of arms and ammunition and could not continue the struggle alone. He radioed for help to Britain and America, but the British and Americans were too busy fighting the Nazis in the West. Prime Minister Churchill cabled to Stalin a request to help the Poles, but Stalin refused. He even refused to allow British and American planes carrying supplies to land on Soviet airfields, so the Poles, desperately short of food and arms, were left to fight it out to the bitter end. A few stragglers from the city, turned out by the Nazis to find their own safety, reached the woods. From them, Ruth learned of Nazis having to fight for every inch of ground, of Poles tearing up the pavement slabs and using them as barricades in the street, and of a message sent to the Pope by the women of Warsaw. "Most Holy Father, for 3 weeks we have lacked food and medicine. Warsaw is in ruins. No one is helping us. The world is ignorant of our fight." On the 2nd of October, the 63rd day of fighting, when the defenders had no more ammunition left, Warsaw broadcast its last appeal to the people of the world. "Without help, this struggle has become hopeless. God is righteous, and in his omnipotence he will punish all those responsible for this terrible injury to the Polish nation." Too late to save the gallant defenders, Stalin changed his plans and ordered the Russians to march. By January 1945, the Nazis had gone and Warsaw was in Russian hands. Because of the fighting, Ruth and Bronya had put off their return to the city until as late as possible. They had left it till winter had already set in, and cold and hunger drove them and the other families from the woods. A rude shock awaited them. The Warsaw they had known and lived in all their lives had vanished. The old town had been wiped out, and there were no streets left. Food was shorter than it had ever been, only a little flour, fat and sugar, no milk at all. Luckily, there was water. Though the mains had been damaged, fresh wells had been dug. Somehow they found their way to the cellar that had been their home for 2 years. There were signs that it had been occupied during the summer and then abandoned. The chairs and beds had gone, probably used as firewood, and the table was broken. There was a dark hole at one end, which Ruth found to be the beginning of a tunnel. It led under the street, joining up with other cellars, other homes. Because of the firing and bombing, nobody had used the streets unless they had to. With the help of this clever network of tunnels, the brave defenders had kept the struggle going all autumn. Patiently and without despair, Ruth set to work to repair the damage. They had no beds, but they still had the blankets they had brought with them from the woods. Friends provided them with sacks to sleep on. Some boys in Ruth's class mended the table and made chairs from boxes. When all was as straight as she could make it, Ruth started up her school again. Some 16 children were squeezed into the cellar. Lessons were always under cover now. One day, something happened which was to change the whole course of her life and to give hope to her flagging spirits. It was a sunny day, and for once there was no firing. The children were out of doors playing a game called Air Raid Alert. One of them would cry, "Alert!" and count up to 50 while the others ran for shelter before he shouted, "Stop!" Anyone who had not found a hiding place by then had to lie down and pretend to be dead. Suddenly Bronya, who was very proud because she'd never been dead yet, came running down to Ruth in the cellar. "There's a boy lying down outside and he won't get up," she cried. "Tickle his ribs," said Ruth. "I don't think he can get up," said Bronya. "Who is it?" "It's not one of the class. I've never seen him before." Ruth went out to investigate. Lying on a heap of rubble, she saw a ragged boy who might have been any age between 9 and 13. His cheeks were thin and pale, and his eyes were closed. A mangy cock with more bone than feather stood by his head and squawked at anyone who went near him. Ruth chased the cock away and knelt down beside the boy. "Does anyone know who he is?" she asked the ring of children around her. Nobody did. "He looks ill and starved," said Ruth. "Yankel, will you help me lift him down to the cellar? And Eva, please find him something to eat, some soup if you can get it." They carried him down to the cellar and laid him gently on the sacks. After a little while he opened his eyes. "Where's Jimpy?" he said. "We'll find Jimpy later," said Ruth. "I think you must have fainted. You'll be all right in a minute." "I want Jimpy," said the boy. "Perhaps Jimpy's the name of the cock," said Bronya. "Yankel, go and fetch the cock," said Ruth. "No fear, he's bitten me twice," said Yankel. Ruth was going to fetch it herself when the cock appeared suddenly in the hole in the wall, squawked, flapped its dusty wings and jumped down beside the boy. "Jimpy! Jimpy!" said the boy and reached out his arms towards the mangy creature. "Well, he's a fine cock and he's got a fine name," said Ruth. "What's your name?" "Shan't tell you," snapped the boy. "Look, Eva's bought some soup for you," said Ruth. "You'll feel better in a minute. Sit up and drink it." "He won't tell us his name," Bronya confided to the crowd at the door. A girl pushed through the crowd and went over to Ruth. She had something in her hand. "I found this in the street where he was lying," she said. "I think it must be his." It was a small wooden box. Bronya seized it. "It's heavy and it rattles. He must be rich," she cried. "Ruth, can we undo the string?" "Give the box to him," said Ruth. "Nobody shall touch it without asking him." The boy took the wooden box and smiled. Everyone wanted to look inside, but he wouldn't undo it. However, he did tell them his name. It was Jan.